Capita envisions a future in which children and families can flourish. By prioritizing our youngest children, their families, and their communities, we have the potential to radically transform the fabric of our societies for the long term. In this series of Capita in Conversation, we talk to interviewees from around the world to hear their stories, knowledge, wisdom, and ideas on how to create child and family flourishing. In this episode, Capita co-founder and CEO Joe Waters interviews Dr. Erin M. Cline, Tagliabue Distinguished Professor in Interfaith Studies Dialogue at Georgetown University and Senior Research Fellow, Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. They discuss Cline's book, Families of Virtue, which compares Confucian and Western views on childhood development and moral education. Cline describes how the Confucian tradition places a special emphasis on filial piety, the deep respect, reverence, and gratitude that children have for their parents. Cline explains how the Confucian view of rituals are central to moral cultivation. Finally, Cline and Waters discuss how the Confucian emphasis on the importance of early childhood development and the role of family and ritual aligns with modern developmental psychology, and how these insights could inform policy and public discourse around families.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joe Waters, co-founder and CEO of Capita, and I'm delighted today to be with Dr. Erin M. Cline. She is the Tagliabue Distinguished Professor of Interfaith Studies Dialogue and Senior Research Fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Erin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to talk about this remarkable book that you have written, Families of Virtue, Confucian and Western Views on Childhood Development, published by Columbia University Press. And I'm trying to find the year 2015, is that right?
That's right.
So it's a few years old, and thank you so much for talking about it. I just discovered it this spring and have found it, as I said, remarkable. Tell us about the book. Let's start there.
One of the questions that I often get as a specialist in Chinese philosophy when I go to dialogue with other philosophers is, well, why should we study Chinese philosophy? What's distinctive about the Chinese tradition? And there are lots of different answers to that. And I often just say, well, you should read some of these thinkers, right? And I think you'll see. But I've increasingly been focused on trying to highlight some of those resources for people, especially some of the ways that I think the Chinese tradition can really be a resource for us in thinking about how to live better lives ourselves, but also how to help build a better society and strengthen the resources that we have in our own society. So that was sort of the inspiration for the book. And the book has three distinct parts, as you know. The first part, I'm describing early Chinese views on the role that parents play in early childhood development. And early Chinese philosophers took a really deep interest, unlike other philosophers around the world. They took a deep interest in early childhood development, especially in moral development. They were especially interested in what's going on in infants, toddlers, young preschoolers, and then children as they grow in terms of their moral development. How are they developing or failing to develop virtues like gratitude, respect for others, compassion, understanding, a range of different virtues. And I really feel like the Chinese tradition has lots to offer us on that count. So the first part of the book looks at the Chinese tradition, describes their views on those issues. The second part of the book describes the history of Western philosophy on that particular set of issues, especially tightly focused on what role parents play or don't play in early childhood moral development. So especially looking at the development of those virtues in young kids and the role that parents and parent-child relationships play. And then the third part of the book looks at how we might apply all of that. So once I've sort of established that Chinese views are distinctive compared with the range of different views that we find around the world, I ask the question, what can we do with them, right? How do they have constructive value for us today?
So how are early Chinese views on child development distinct? Why should they be studied?
The early Chinese tradition really argued from the very start, and in particular, the Confucian tradition argued from the very start, that filial piety, which is this deep-seated sense of respect, reverence, love, and gratitude that children have for their parents, even beginning at a very young age. It's sort of the natural response of love and gratitude to those who care for you and nurture you and love you. They saw that virtue as the root of other virtues, and they make that claim in one of the earliest and really one of the most influential texts in the world, the Confucian Analects. So Kongzi Confucius is focused on that idea that really accords the virtue of filial piety and parent-child relationships more generally a special place in the tradition. And the Confucians are deeply interested in moral cultivation, the development of virtues, but they are especially interested in the role that the family plays in nurturing virtues in us.
So, in the last several weeks, there's been a lot of talk about the importance of family. There has, J.D. Vance, of course, made his infamous now childless cat lady comment, not recently, but it has emerged in the last several weeks as a point of discussion and dialogue in the presidential campaign. One of the things that I thought was quite interesting in the book is that not only is family emphasized, right, but even those who don't have families, widowers, widows, are still included in the vision of the Confucian philosophers. They're highly prioritizing family. They're highly prioritizing the moral development of children, the role of parents in that, while at the same time ensuring regard in the society for people who don't have children. They're not second-class citizens.
Yeah, that's right. Because the main focus of the Confucians is on the fact that all of us had parents. All of us had people who cared for us, who nurtured us, who helped us to develop different virtues. So they are more focused on that than on, who has children and is doing the nurturing and how that shapes us. And we can talk about that. And they do have things to say about that. But they are most focused on the way in which the beginnings of virtues comes from our response initially to our parents and our primary caregivers, right? And then we build on that foundation and it shapes our responses to others in a wide range of different ways. And it makes it easier for us to love and trust and care for others, or can make it harder for us to do that. And so that's what they're really focused on. That's a shared experience. They also have a really expansive conception of the family. So I often remind my students when we begin to study Chinese philosophy, I remind them, okay, when we talk about the family here, we're not just talking about mom, dad, your siblings, right? We're talking about your grandparents. We're talking about your great-grandparents. We're talking about your aunts and uncles, your cousins. We're talking about all the members of a family. Some of those people are going to be married, some not. Some are going to have kids, some not, right? But everybody has a distinctive role to play in a family. And different people, as we all know, play distinctive roles in nurturing and encouraging us and helping to support our development.
And I think one of the things that's interesting about that, too, is the way in which it looks not only forward to children as the future, but also back historically, ancestrally, to the ancestors. And that there's, in some ways, if I'm reading correctly, we need to have as much regard for the ancestors as we have for our descendants, for the future.
That's absolutely right. So for the Confucians, it's helpful to us when we think about ourselves, our lives, and it's helpful to our moral development if we can see ourselves as standing in a lineage. And the truth is that we're all of us are standing in the middle. It's a lineage that stretches back in time, and it's a lineage that stretches forward in time. So it's helpful from a Confucian standpoint for us to look back at the people who have gone before us. It reminds us of lots of things. And this is what Confucian ancestor veneration rituals were dedicated to, getting us to meditate on the lives of our great-grandparents, our great-great-grandparents, and of course, people who are closer that we might remember, like our grandparents, but getting us to think about their lives, the things that they faced, the things that they overcame, the things they didn't overcome, right? And then to stop and reflect on ourselves and our own lives and see how we can do better by seeing ourselves in relation to those who have gone before us, that we literally have a sense of oneness with, right? We share DNA with them. We are part of the same traditions, the family traditions that are passed on a daily basis, but also see ourselves as part of a lineage that stretches forward in time. So the question then becomes, how will we be viewed by our descendants? and how can we serve as good resources for them when they go to look back at us. You know, a good friend of mine who's a Jesuit was recently talking to me about his nieces. And of course, he isn't married, doesn't have children, but he is really important in the lives of his nieces. And when he had a health scare, he said, I suddenly thought, I remember being told about this uncle or that uncle that died young, and I don't want to be one of those people. I want to be here to see them grow up, to be a part of their lives, and to be here for them when they have questions and problems, right? And so again, even those of us in families who don't have children, we all have important roles to play.
So for the Confucians, and I think you've already suggested some elements that are important, but for them, how does the moral development of young children happen?
It happens largely through the practice of ritual. Confucianism is absolutely and fundamentally animated by ritual practice. The Confucians were the earliest ritual theorists in the world, and they articulate very clear and sophisticated views on how rituals help us to cultivate virtues. What they believed is that when we go to practice traditional rituals, they are not just expressing virtues. So, for example, if you go to practice a ritual for a Confucian would be something like writing a thank you note, right? But writing a thank you note doesn't just express gratitude, it also deepens or cultivates gratitude in us. But it can only function in that way to make us better if we're fully present when we perform the ritual. Okay, so we have to really think about what we're doing, bring our entire self to it, stop and take the time to remember what the person has done for you, the history of your relationship. And it's a contemplative practice. Rituals are contemplative practices. They're deeply meditative. They're not sort of the rote going through the motions. Confucius, from the beginning of the tradition, is criticizing people in his culture who are starting to just go through the motions and who are therefore saying, we can get rid of this ritual. This is a waste of time. Everybody's just going along. And he's saying, wait, no, these are really, really important practices because this is actually how we become good. It's how we create and sustain relationships. And it's not just how we express virtues, it's how we cultivate them. So that world of rituals is how young children, and actually if you look at Confucian ritual texts, they interestingly include rituals for the youngest members of Confucian communities. So beginning even during pregnancy, there are particular rituals that mothers were encouraged to practice that are designed to help women to feel happier and more hopeful, more uplifted. So we might think about them as forms of meditation. And the idea is that they knew there was a connection between mothers and their children even before children are born, right? And they were working at how can we intervene in that connection and strengthen it so that we can help kids when they come out. Then, of course, there are rituals that are observed with infants and very, very young children, both boys and girls, going all the way up through every year of a child's development. So they're included in rituals right from the start.
There's a lot of that sounds resonant with some Western philosophical traditions, but not the Western philosophical tradition that's probably been dominant over the last 250 or so years. So can we move into just the comparison, right, which is the second major part of your book, comparing these Confucian views on moral development of young children and then Western views. So what are the key differences, but also what are some of the similarities you saw?
So I think some of the important differences are that the Confucians are especially interested in the process of cultivating virtues and how it's done. So if you take a look at Aristotle, you get this incredible, in the Nicomachean Ethics, you get this incredible account of the virtues, right? And what are the more important virtues, the less important virtues, incredible, beautiful work, incredible descriptions of virtues. But Aristotle doesn't have very much to say about how exactly we cultivate those virtues. He defines them, he explains how they're related to vices, right? So he's less interested in that practical question. The Confucians are deeply interested in that practical question. And they do describe virtues, but they're more focused on how we cultivate them, right? And that's what led to their focus on ritual. They were convinced that that was the primary tool for cultivation. The Confucians also are more inclusive in their overall vision of ethics from the start. So as I mentioned, young children and children's development is taken seriously in the tradition from the start, which is unfortunately not always the case in the history of Western philosophy, right? So it's really with contemporary feminist ethics that you get these really wonderful accounts of families and children and how virtue develops in those contexts. The Confucians were including children from the start. The Confucians were also including women from the very start in the practice of ritual. Aristotle, of course, by contrast, says that women are not moral agents. Nothing in his account of ethics applies to women. And of course, we can try to, we can present contemporary amended versions of Aristotle and still apply, and say, okay, well, we need to fix that part. But interestingly, right from the start, the Confucians maintained that women absolutely can cultivate not just virtues, but roughly the same set of virtues as men. And that makes them look really, really different from a host of different Western philosophers.
So there's a point you make in the book, which I think is really important, and I want to emphasize it because I think it's important for both how we approach policy related to families and also how we approach sort of broader public questions that relate to families. And that is Western philosophy, as I think I understand it, tends to view ethical questions as mediating concerns between two individuals. Whereas the Confucian approach is a familial approach that not only extends to sort of the living members of the family, but also it sort of extends to the future and also extends to the past, right? And so I think that's an interesting description, an interesting element to point out, because it seems to me, if I'm reading correctly, that from the very beginning of the Western approach to ethics, it's been sort of individualist, whereas in the Confucian tradition, it has been from the beginning familialist.
I think that's right. I think there is just a fundamental difference there. And I always want people to understand, it's not that, as I point out in the book, it's not that Western philosophers haven't talked about filial piety. They have, and very early in the tradition. So Thomas Aquinas, for example, has this remarkable account of filial piety in the Summa. But filial piety doesn't play the fundamental role in his thought that it plays in Confucian thought. So the Confucians had so much more and devoted entire texts to that virtue and saw it as foundational in a way. So part of what I'm trying to explore in the book is do they get that right? So I very much operate as a philosopher. I tend to, at a certain point, I just want to pose this question, is it true? What do they get right? What do they get wrong? What do we need to amend in order to make it a more defensible account? What can we learn? What constructive value does it have? All of the evidence that we have in looking at early childhood, parent-child relationships, and the role that they play in our development suggests that it would behoove us to invest so much more in families, and especially in nurturing the children during their earliest years of development, and supporting families. Of course, that support also needs to be extended to schools. And I have 3 kids who are in 4th grade, 8th grade, and 9th grade now. And so they have to listen to me talk about this quite a lot. But it was interesting. We were talking about the fact that teachers tend to be paid more as you advance in grades, right? So some teachers will move to middle school. The pay is better, right? And I told my children, this is just not the way that it should be set up, right? Because, of course, if we understand how pivotal those earliest years of children's lives are, we are going to invest so much more, not just in elementary education, but in even before they get to elementary school, and especially looking at families and how we support families, how we allow parents to have the time to spend with their children, really quality time, and everyone wins from that. And it's a win in every way. And we have such great policy research in this area. So I think there's a lot to commend that sort of approach.
So I think one of the things that you point out very nicely in the book is that there's a real harmony between the Confucian philosophical tradition, some elements of the Western philosophical tradition, and the science now of human development, the brain science, we often call it, that has been really sort of established and more popularized over, say, the last 3 or 4 decades. So is there something in there that maybe surprised you, or when you sort of dug into the brain science, the science of early human development, were you kind of like, oh, the Chinese had this right a long, long time ago, and now Western science has really just sort of caught up and confirmed the intuition of the ancients?
I think I was definitely surprised by and taken aback by how early rituals are regarded by the Confucians as being central to human development. So I mean, the truth is that it's kind of amazing to look at 4th century BCE texts that recognize that what happens during pregnancy can affect a child in deep and enduring ways over the course of their life. And that what happens to them as an infant is really important, that they're not just these little blobs, right? That there's a lot going on inside of them. And I found it really extraordinary that these early Chinese thinkers, again, in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries BCE, were clearly making empirical observations of young children, were watching them and recognized some of what was going on with them. They don't get everything right, but I think it's extraordinary that they got that right. And then, of course, it eventually takes us a long time to really sort of get there, and over time with science. But I think it's amazing the ways in which they anticipated that.
One of the things that long has frustrated me is that in the United States, at least, and I think across Western societies more broadly, family policy focused on children tends to be considered, not an especially grown up policy area. And I think in some ways that hasn't even changed as the science has become clearer. So, I mean, if you're thinking about sort of the ancient Chinese and these Confucian philosophers, I mean, how would they have approached the family as a matter of sort of public concern, as a matter of concern for the society and an object of the government, the governor, the king's interest?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think what they ultimately do, and their sort of way of proceeding, is to look at good kings, good leaders, and then to look at bad leaders, right? And by the Han, which is roughly 200 BCE to 200 of the Common Era, they had a really, really bad leader, right? A really vicious leader who ruled brutally, right? So this is the first emperor, the Qin emperor. And they posed this interesting question. They said, what's the difference? What's the difference between these kings, these leaders who ruled humanely and with compassion and who cared about widows and orphans and supported families from the earliest stage of their kids' development, really, I mean, were interested and engaged in leading, compared with this other guy who's brutal? What was the difference? And what they said is they were raised differently, right? It goes back to their earliest stages of development. And they actually say explicitly, from the moment the good kings were born, their caregivers were following these rituals with them and participating in rituals with them and bringing them along and nurturing them and explaining, here's why we do it this way and not that way. Look at this person over here. They seem left out. Let's include them, and explaining why everybody has a place in different rituals. That's what made the difference.
Let's talk more about ritual, because I think one of the features of contemporary American life is that for the first time in our history, fewer than half of us belong to a church, mosque, or synagogue. And so we're at least participating less in traditional religious ritual. First of all, say more about why that might matter. And then secondly, one of the things that we're very interested in is how we can reproduce the ritual effects of religious practice, if we can call it that, in a more secular public life, because it seems clear to us that much of what affects us is a lack of sort of meaning, purpose, that often is communicated to the next generation through ritual. I mean, our friend at Harvard, Rick Weisbord, has a survey where it's some astounding number. I don't have it off the top of my head. Astounding percentage of young people say that life has no meaning, right? That we're likely participating in, at least in traditional religious ritual, less and less. So just love to hear what we might learn from, the Confucian philosophers here.
Yeah, and that's right. I mean, I think as we look at the challenges that we see, I mean, demographically looking at young people, and I see it in my students. I see the struggles with anxiety and depression, and there are lots of contributing factors to that. And there recently, especially, really important work and conversations being had about that, especially the role of technology. But I do think one contributing factor is the decreasing number of rituals that animate our lives. I think one of the reasons the Confucian tradition is an especially great resource for our society at this present moment is that the Confucians have a very expansive definition of ritual. It's so expansive, in fact, that my students often stumble over it when I'm introducing it, because it doesn't just include religious rituals. It does include religious rituals, among other things, but they also include what we would call social customs, matters of etiquette. Again, I gave the example earlier, things like writing a thank you note, right? Those are rituals, right? And so a part of what they do in calling all of these things rituals is they regard them all with a sense of sacredness. So when you do all of those things, you're not just going through the motions, you're not just following a social custom. You regard the thing you're doing as a ritual. You make it sacred. You invest it with meaning. You do it by being fully present, by bringing your heart as well as your mind to the practice that you're engaged in. So I think that's helpful for us because, again, a lot of people have found themselves leaving traditional religious communities. Now, of course, I'm a theology professor, right? And so I tend to be interested in how can we amend religious communities to get people back, right? To make people feel more at home in them. I think that's one kind of task. But as someone who works on Confucianism, I think a part of what we need to do is to expand our understanding of what rituals are. We're going to need to innovate some rituals because American culture generally tends to have fewer rituals. It always has had fewer rituals than, say, if you look at East Asian cultures, South Asian cultures, many other cultures. But we're going to need to work hard, especially because a lot of the rituals we have been abandoned or are being abandoned. That's exactly the position that the early Confucians found themselves in. They were trying to get people to stop throwing away rituals, disregarding them. They were trying to get people to return to the rituals. So some of this is going to be a process of recovery and of reflecting deeply on, okay, why are funerals important? Why are mourning periods important, right? Maybe they actually have therapeutic value for us, right? Maybe it isn't actually good for us to just expect that we pick up the pieces and move on. Maybe we need dedicated space to process grief and loss in our lives. Those are some of the most important things that rituals carved out space for, and some of the most important ways in which they were therapeutic resources for people. So I always tell my students, before we had therapy, there were rituals, right, that did that work. That's how that work was done in ancient China, right? Those are the spaces where you talked about losses and shared the losses with others and very publicly wept and wailed and grieved losses with others.
And my observation too is that a lot of the rituals we do have are increasingly grafted onto some sort of market exchange, right? So I think when I've experienced a big ritual moment with lots and lots of people in contemporary life outside of church, it tends to be something like Carolina Panthers football game, right? But underneath the surface of that, I mean, people are having a great time and they've really bonded over a team. But under the surface of that is just people making money, right? Like it is just a market exchange. It seems like there's no way in which we are sort of innovating new rituals in ways that just aren't also market exchanges.
That's right. And so, I mean, it's interesting to think about what makes something a ritual, right? So you think about attending a game and what you do around games. The singing of the national anthem is a ritual. That's a part of all those activities, right? And a part of what identifies it as a ritual is that we bring a certain degree of solemnity to it, right? A certain degree of reverence. Rituals are times that we stop, reflect, acknowledge what's happening, acknowledge how we're related to other people, to institutions. And that's sort of a defining feature of ritual. One of the things the early Confucians note is that it can be really tempting for us to make rituals into sort of opportunities for a display of wealth. This is just naturally tempting for us, right? So to throw a very lavish party to commemorate a particular occasion, and we can get caught up in all the trappings. And this troubled Confucius because he felt like when we get caught up in the trappings, then we lose the meaning of the ritual and we're not really able to be fully present. And so one of the things we have to sort of watch, again, is the relation, like you're noting, the relationship to money, right? The relationship to wealth. So he says of ritual in the Analects that Confucius says, better spare than extravagant, right? Being spare allows us to focus on what we're doing and why and what's really important about it.
Raise a very interesting question to me. How can we amend religious communities so that people feel more at home? You have your finger on the pulse of these things, particularly working in a theology department at a place like Georgetown. What are you seeing in terms of the religious communities, the ritual communities that are working today, particularly for families with young children?
I think one of the challenges is that churches have not tended to change as American culture has changed. So the basic setup in churches, synagogues, mosques has remained constant. And of course, tradition's important and rituals are important and you don't want too much change, right? But as American culture has undergone tremendous change, there's been very little amendment to what services look like, right? So in order to stay alive, rituals have to be somewhat dynamic. And in the Confucian Analects, Confucius actually tells us, he says, you want ritual changes to be small, but you also want to recognize when you're in danger of losing people because you're not willing to change a ritual. And so the example he gives is that the particular ritual cap that people traditionally wore in Confucian rituals, the material was very expensive. It was very expensive to buy a hemp cap, and that was a traditional fabric. And he said, look, we need to be willing to let people substitute silk for hemp and have the material of the head covering be different because it's frugal and it'll allow people to keep practicing the ritual, right? It doesn't change the substance of the ritual, but it will keep people there, right? So the people who couldn't otherwise afford it will continue to participate. So I think a part of what we want to do as religious communities is to look at how can we help people participate? How can we continue to be more accessible? One of the biggest reasons young families with young children are not in traditional services on weekends, of course, has to do with the push for extracurricular activities and sports in particular, and the fact that sports have bled over, and I've watched this change over the course of my own life, sports have come to dominate the entire weekend. And so that becomes a challenge for parents who want their kids to be able to do different kinds of activities and have the enrichment from that. But there isn't protected space for religion and spirituality and the goods that are associated with it. So I would say, and I will tell you, I am a part of a church plant in the Diocese of Washington in the Episcopal Church. I host a house church out of my home, and it's a service that was designed by an Episcopal priest for families like mine who had children with special needs. It's based on a traditional Episcopal service, but we meet in my home so that kids can sort of wander in and out of the room as they need to. My son sometimes, who's autistic, sometimes brings his frogs and other things into the space to show everyone and share. He sometimes has outbursts of questions and other things, and other children do too. And sometimes the adults who are there say, I always had that question too. Can we just stop and talk about that? So it's a very different worship style, even though it includes many of the same elements of a recognizable Episcopal Christian service. So there's flexibility. The Bishop of Washington has come and visited us and is sort of proud of that alternative model. And I think we want to think creatively as a part of different religions to think about how we can welcome people in different ways.
You make very clear that the Confucian philosophers considered the sacrifice and investment that is required to raise children, not as a personal preference, but as a contribution to the greater good. And I think one of the things that I've been particularly concerned about in recent years is that the choice to have a child increasingly is essentially a lifestyle choice. And I think that has contributed to this sort of polarizing divide between those who have children and those who J.D. Vance has called the childless cat ladies, right? So, I mean, not so much from a practical policy standpoint, but from a philosophical perspective, what sort of needs to change in terms of how politicians in particular view the having and the raising of children and family life in general in the United States and other Western rich democratic societies?
I think one of the things that we want to look closely at is the fact that we're all deeply interconnected, right? And this is especially challenging for us as Americans because we tend culturally, we just tend to think individualistically. So we don't naturally tend to think of ourselves in sort of the traditional Confucian way, which would be, if I think in that way, then I'm always thinking about myself as a daughter, a sister, an aunt, a mother, a friend, a teacher. I am the different roles and relationships that I stand. That's who I am. There is no self that's just me beyond that. When I teach Confucianism, my students always express the worry that, but don't you lose the self? Like, don't you lose the person in all of that if you're just your roles? For the Confucians, that was an expansive sense of self rather than a sort of diminished sense of self. We are more when we are in relationship to others. I think all of us, whether or not we have children or not, I mean, we all recognize that we are happy when we have people that we care about in our lives and people who care about us, right? And that might be a larger circle or a smaller circle. It may be a mixture of family, friends, a community, religious communities, family of choice. There are lots of a wide range of constellations of relationships, but we flourish to a greater degree when we see ourselves in relation to others and when we love others and when we're loved by others. So I think the more that we can see ourselves as deeply interconnected, the more that we really are seeing ourselves and our society more clearly.
Final question is, your book, this book in particular, is a wonderful example of how the humanities can enrich thinking about public concerns, thinking about the common good, connecting the dots between theoretical and the concrete in enriching and strengthening our society. Yet, the humanities, as you well know, are not in great shape, particularly in our universities. So, I mean, maybe the question is like, what is your message to other scholars who maybe tend to get slotted into their particular niche about how they should engage with broader publics and in particular with policymakers? Because I don't think that is something a lot of humanists are doing.
Yeah, I think we have all of this great science, and I think we're so aware of the science on early childhood, what we should be doing in schools, the differences that can be made. But as my colleagues in the social sciences all know, they can keep putting this research forward and people can just keep ignoring it. I think the humanities can be really helpful there because if we want to get people to think about themselves, their lives, and their society in different ways, if we want to get them to think beyond the way things are and embrace some different kinds of alternatives, we're going to need to get people to think about our own culture and the reasons why we hold the views that we do. We're also going to need to be willing to look at other traditions and cultures, at different ways of doing things and thinking about things.
Super. Thank you so much, Erin.
Thank you.
This is a great conversation, really. We try to bring this sort of conversation into our work at Capita as much as possible.
Oh, I'm so glad. Well, I've loved getting a chance to visit with you, and it's great to meet you.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Each episode of Capita in Conversation is produced by Michael Bettis and is available by podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as capita.org.